Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are delighted to begin this webinar. The webinar will be presenting the research from a collaboration between the Global Education Cluster and Child Protection Area of Responsibility on making guidance accessible. Before we move on to introducing the speakers, let us just do some housekeeping. So there is a closed caption facility available in French, Portuguese, Arabic, and Spanish. This is an automated translation provided by Microsoft Teams, and Translators Without Borders is not involved in the translation of the captions. The webinar will be recorded and is being recorded. To ask any questions at any time, please post your question in the question and answer tab in the Teams channel. So let me now introduce Michelle Brown to do the opening speech. Michelle is the Global Education Cluster co-coordinator, and she'll be introducing the research and the webinar for us. Over to you, Michelle.
Oh, thank you, and welcome to everybody on the line today. Good morning and afternoon. We're delighted to welcome you. So really just thinking about why did we commission this research on the accessibility of global guidance? Well, both the education clusters and the CPAORs, in collaboration with their partners, obviously produce a lot of guidance. And that was totally exacerbated within COVID times, where there was a lot of stuff going out from global level down. Which took a lot of time to plan, to create, launch and distribute. At the same time, as you know, with COVID, there was even more imperative to work collaboratively, work in partnership with local organisations and national actors. So making sure that the guidance that is produced is relevant and accessible is even more important. However, we were not really sure how successful we are in getting guidance that we produce into the right hands. And we also weren't sure about how useful, readable, understandable, and applicable the guidance was that we did produce. So really this research that Alice will present on later was born out of a genuine desire to understand how accessible or not our guidance was, so that we could work with partners over the longer term to make sure that how we write our guidance is more accessible. It's been fantastic to also work with the CPAOR as well as education, because it means we've got a wider field of scope to look at. And also, likely the types of findings won't be sector specific, so will probably be much more widely available and accessible to other clusters. So really the research and its findings are vital for any of us producing new guidance, and they should also be useful for cluster coordinators in country who are making decisions about rolling guidance out. We really hope that this will be very relevant for our local partners, as the research clearly indicates how valued localization is and what a difference it makes to the reception of guidance. And so should be yet more encouragement for all of us to be working to be a more inclusive development process. Finally, some of the issues raised have significant cost implications, but many are practical, cost-free suggestions which could still make a big difference. So we need to raise the issue of resourcing localization and distribution of guidance with donors to really get the most from the findings of the research. So thank you very much, and I'm delighted to hand over to, I believe, Alice.
Wonderful, thank you very much. It's lovely to have the introduction. Okay, I'm going to be presenting the research, and this research, as Michelle was just saying, has been supported by the Global Education Cluster and the Child Protection Area Responsibility, and was funded through the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs through Save the Children Norway and from Education Cannot Wait. And there's a lot to say about it, and we're obviously just going to be presenting the highlights. So, as Michelle was just saying, the clusters wanted to know if their guidance was easy to get and relevant and appealing, with a real sense of wanting to find out what worked and what didn't so that they could improve guidance over time. We did this research during the period of COVID. Obviously, it was planned before that, so you might imagine that things changed a lot in the process. But we researched in 3 contexts in the end, which were chosen for their language diversity. One was Mozambique, the other was DRC, and the third was the refugee context of the Rohingya response in Bangladesh. We chose these 3 because they were all multilingual contexts, and each one had a different dominant language. We also interviewed people who were involved in commissioning and writing guidance. In every context where we did the research, we tried to speak to people who were working at different levels, both in international and national NGOs and with government staff. And we also used an electronic survey to try and get a lot of responses. And in the end, we got about 325 responses to the electronic survey, and we managed to speak directly to 175 people through a combination of interviews and focus groups. So we were relatively satisfied with that. The limitation perhaps of the research that we did was, although we managed to do the face-to-face groups, they were relatively small ones. And in Bangladesh, we were not able to get to do the face-to-face focus groups. We could only do face-to-face interviews, which were a little bit less satisfactory in terms of getting the debate that we managed to get from Mozambique and DRC, but it did allow us to test some of the materials. So what did we do? We were testing the materials. In each context, we looked at a selection of global materials and some of the local materials which were produced by the cluster. With some documents, we showed the original and a translated excerpt and an excerpt that was rewritten using plain language principles. So this helped us to understand what were the factors that made materials more appealing and easier to understand. For the local languages, materials were presented in Burmese and Bangla for Bangladesh, French, Swahili, Nande and Lingala for DRC, Portuguese, Shangana and Sena for Mozambique. So we managed to cover a reasonable number of languages. So what did we find? We broadly are going to divide our findings into 2 categories: physical barriers and barriers to understanding. For the physical access barriers, there were some major issues, and I think it was really interesting when we did this to find out just how difficult people found it to get guidance. Everybody, I guess, across the board struggled to some extent to find guidance, and we had expected there to be a very big difference between the people who did the electronic survey and therefore had access to some kind of technology to do that, and those in the focus groups. But we found that even those who filled out the electronic survey had difficulties in physically accessing guidance. Clusters are making choices about what they disseminate, and this is really welcomed by practitioners. People felt overwhelmed by the volume of information that comes to them, and they're very pleased that local clusters are helping them prioritise for their limited time and their limited bandwidth. However, amongst the survey participants, so those are those people who have connectivity, there was still a really significant proportion of people who had never accessed any cluster materials before. And that's the data that you're seeing on the screen. Overall, there were high levels of difficulty getting materials, but some groups, and that was really notably teachers and school principals and child protection managers, found it a very serious challenge. Bangladesh is the kind of outlier in this research in lots of ways, actually, and it was partly because we were only able to speak to people who were working with NGOs, no government staff, and partly that there were constraints to connectivity in that particular context, but also that perhaps by being a very contained setting, there was more access from the cluster to people to its practitioners. However, they did express concerns on a number of issues, and we'll come on to those. As you might expect, in general, those working for government and those working for local NGOs consistently faced more challenges to accessing information than those in the better resourced international NGOs. So internet was a major barrier for many participants, and this included challenges in finding materials amongst the large volumes and all the multiple repositories, searching and download speeds, and the cost of data, and access to electricity. And we do know anecdotally that lots of people were accessing materials from mobile phones, and so that's perhaps something else that needs to be kept in mind when materials are being developed. The next issue was time constraints, which was a major barrier to people accessing guidance. There were several people who commented that they were having to do multiple roles to sustain their livelihoods, and perhaps had even less time than their managers perhaps anticipated that they would have done. There were also issues even when hard copies were available. People commented that they were bulky to carry, that there were never enough of them, and that they often stayed on the desks of senior colleagues, and that in some cases that the paper that they were printed on just wasn't durable enough, and so they ended up disintegrating. The second set of barriers were barriers to understanding, and those encompassed a very wide range of issues, from format to design to writing styles. In general, overall, if we need to summarise it, participants really preferred cluster materials to be in the form of short written documents and practical guidance. And illustration was very well received, particularly in the conversations with their focus groups, and where it got very positive feedback. There was quite a significant mismatch between the provision of what existed and the preferred languages. And apologies if this slide is slightly slipped. I'm not sure if you can see all the data. People wanted to receive materials and in the languages that they speak predominantly. And in all three countries, there was a concern that the technical guidance shared by the clusters was not available in the languages, the most relevant languages for their contexts. That included Mozambican Portuguese, Congolese Swahili, Bangla and Burmese for the Rohingya response. A quick review of the main outline, of the main resource libraries for child protection and education does support what they were saying, in the sense that English language resources are by far the most numerous, and recent resources are also available in Arabic, French, Spanish, and sometimes in Portuguese. So you can see from all of these diagrams or these bar charts above that the request for multiple languages was in all three contexts. And that there was also a mismatch even between the official language and the languages being requested. In focus group discussions, there was they highlighted a number of examples of technical terms that people struggled to understand. So just to give a few examples, in Mozambique, for example, they included words such as resilience and intervention, cognitive, all of those being in the original Portuguese. So technical jargon was flagged as a major challenge to understanding across all three contexts. 35% of respondents in Mozambique said it made resources difficult to understand, and that rose to 47% in DRC and 42% in Bangladesh. There were also issues around abbreviations, which were frequently identified as problematic, particularly things like EHA or WASH, or abbreviations which were left in the original English despite the document being moved to another language, for example, UXO. Finally, on language, there were concerns both in Mozambique and in DRC that the local form of the language should be used. Brazilian Portuguese was not suitable for Mozambican audiences, who identified that many words had their meaning lost. Similarly, in DRC, the focus groups identified that Kenyan and Tanzanian Swahili was being used for translation, which isn't suitable for DRC. One really crucial point that was raised, and for us this was perhaps one of the unexpected findings and one of the very interesting ones, was that many people we spoke to used the guidance to speak to other people in the local community members. For example, head teachers needed to make explanations of the guidance to parents, or social workers were using the guidance to discuss things with foster carers. This meant that they were having to interpret the key message into local languages themselves. What practitioners really wanted were materials that described the most important concepts in very clear, straightforward terms, so that they could then explain them more easily to the communities they worked with. Another issue which made a big difference was localization. Where people recognised themselves and their context, there was much more enthusiasm for the document. Locally produced guidance with locally developed pictures came in for a lot of praise. And in particular, when guidance explicitly referenced ministry regulations or ministry-led guidance, there was a real sense that people would take that guidance and use it and would feel very confident in using it. So there was a real sense that where guidance was connected with something also authorised by the ministry, that made a big difference. In the focus groups, we tested source material either with full or substantial excerpts. Then in these documents, there was often quite dense text with long sentences and abstract nouns and statements of principle, perhaps without text boxes or graphics. And participants found this really challenging. When we tested the recall of the key information using the same material but rewritten in the plain language, the retention rates of the information increased. And then when we translated the source material into local languages and then tested recall again, the retention of information really significantly increased further, and that was particularly true for people working in rural areas. When people have really little time for reading, it can mean a lot to keep documents short and put the crucial information at the start and say things really simply. In several focus groups, the issue of legibility came up. Lots of people commented on font size and saying that it was too small, and many people said it was difficult to read text that was overlaid on top of pictures or where there was poor contrast between the text and the picture. We also had comments about layout, with several people mentioning that it was hard to keep places in pages where there were multiple columns, and they expressed a preference for bullet points. Finally, as you can see from the graphs, the topic, the language and the ease of access were the most important three factors for deciding whether or not to read a resource. But there's also some interest in video and online content, and illustration remained important. So we're going to have a look at some of the recommendations. From such a wealth of data, we had lots to pull out. And just to say that in the research report itself, there's a kind of checklist of all of the things that came out of this research, but we're just going to highlight some of them through this presentation. First of all, on the issues of physical access, which I suspect probably speak most directly to local cluster coordinators and their teams who are trying to get guidance out to partners. Then we're going to have a look at some of the barriers to overcoming understanding, which is probably going to speak more directly to people who are commissioning new work, perhaps. So, printing materials came out as one of the major recommendations, and something, printing and distributing obviously has a cost implication and has been particularly difficult during times of COVID. So we all recognise why it's hard, but it really did come out as a huge request. Also, dividing longer materials into modules so that it could be shared more easily and perhaps didn't rest on one person's desk for too long. And getting plenty of copies out to rural areas and particularly to government colleagues. There were many participants who depended on training and cluster meetings to get copies of material. They really appreciated having that kind of introduction to the material, a sort of spoken introduction to the material, and then a takeaway document that they could go away with to help them remember it. Where COVID kind of prevents the physical version of this, then a live presentation of the material followed by a direct email to their account is a good option. When there are multiple documents, and particularly where people's bandwidth are low, it's really helpful to summarize, to email people directly and to summarize which document is which, summarizing the content in a couple of sentences so people don't waste precious downloading time downloading the wrong document. This quote, I think, said really nicely what a lot of people were feeling. It told us very much that people wanted documents that gave them the information they needed quickly with the least possible effort from the reader. And this is supported by the principles of plain language. We're now going to try and give a little bit more detail of what that means for writers and for designers. The material needs to help people get the most important information as early on in the document as possible. and it needs to be written with a non-technical audience in mind. The more familiar the words are and the shorter the sentences are, the easier it will be for everybody to read it. Having said all of this, it was true that people had a very high respect for the relevance of the materials that they were being sent, and I think that's a credit both to the global cluster and those others producing materials, but also to the local clusters who are helping prioritise. Documents need to reflect the language that people want to read in. The writing team need to adjust their own language using short sentences and familiar terms. Avoid acronyms and technical terms, particularly when they're going to be translated. For example, EIE doesn't mean education in emergencies if you're speaking another language, and CP won't stand for child protection if you're using another language. So the acronyms also need to be very carefully considered. Obviously, if you're going to support colleagues by producing materials in the right languages, you need to know what languages are spoken in that particular context. A multi-sector needs assessment, for example, is a great way of collecting household level data, which can then be used to identify what languages are spoken by whom, and therefore how you need to produce your material. It obviously has the added advantage of enabling you to address language as a factor of vulnerability and exclusion in all the programming and in wider communication strategies. And just to note that TWB, we've mapped language in 18 different contexts, and that data can be found on the Humanitarian Data Exchange website. Checking the familiarity of words might sound obvious, but in fact, it's not often done. If you do a search online, it's quite easy to find, certainly for the major languages, lists of familiar words, the frequency of which words are used, and that can tell you how familiar they'll be to the reader and allow you to make some good decisions. For example, humanitarian is probably less recognised than aid, or sexual exploitation and abuse is relatively complicated phrasing, whereas sexual abuse might be much more recognised. Also remember that in general, more familiar words and shorter sentences in your original document are likely to result in better quality translation when you get to that stage. There is a lot of guidance globally around from organisations that support people with visual impairments about how to make materials as legible as possible. It's a good idea to assume that a proportion of your audience have some difficulty seeing and to try and design with that in mind. Even for those without sight impairments, the suggestions on this slide are a good way of reducing reading effort. And I think what we learned through the research is that, in fact, everybody who we spoke to throughout the research appreciated when material was easier to read. So even where people had good levels of reading, were reading in a language that they were confident in, and didn't have particular eyesight problems, people were very keen to have material that spoke to them quickly and got them the information in the easiest way with the least possible reading effort. So I have concluded the summary of the presentation, and I hope it was clear enough. I'm very happy now to take some questions. I'm going to move to the final slide.
Thank you very much, Alice. Shall we have questions? You can unmute yourself or post your questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, just to clarify, Kamal, people are able to post the questions, not unmute. So please do post the questions in the Q&A function. Thank you.
Excuse me, I think you might be getting background noise from my end. Mia, have we had any questions coming in?
No questions so far.
Actually, just one came in. So it says, regarding printing, would the education cluster and the child protection area of responsibility consider eco-efficient printing? The quality would indeed be different.
Okay, I'm not sure that I have an answer for that, because if I'm absolutely honest, I'm not sure what eco-friendly printing is. Is there anyone else from our presenters team who is able to address that? Or perhaps the person who wrote the question could give us some information about what that means.
Yeah, that also caught me a bit unprepared because I'm not sure what it means, but perhaps missing or excluding pictures or things that would take too much space and printing ink. I think that's a good suggestion, but not sure how if we can put it in the recommendation sections of the research.
Okay. Yes, I mean that sounds a sensible approach, and I guess, you know, it would always make sense to be able to produce a short summary of documents where it's a long guidance, and that might be a good way of using less material but being able to get the message around to lots of people. Thank you for that question.
So there's another question coming in asking about, so it says, very interesting research findings. Am I right in understanding that the findings suggest that local language is more important than plain language in a bigger language?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I think what we found was that both were important. So I don't think we made a judgment about one being more important than the other. I would suggest that they're serving slightly different functions. The plain language in the bigger language is very important, and I think that will allow people who have who may be struggling with being able to read a complicated document to be able to read it better, more successfully get the information. So where you've got an extremely multilingual context, doing a very good plain language in the version in the biggest languages I think is a very good first step. What I think is then important for the local languages is to make sure that at least the key concepts are described somewhere in local language. It may be that you don't necessarily have to produce the entire document in all the local languages, but that you could make sure that the key concepts are available so that when people are using, trying to make a description, for example, a head teacher trying to discuss something with parents, they have the right way to phrase some of the most important points in making that transition. Thank you, that was a really interesting question.
There's a couple more questions related to plain language, and I think some of it you just answered, but one question asking about what specific steps should cluster coordinators do when developing or disseminating guidance and guidelines, and also another question around what an ideal length of guidance would be given if we collected any information on the ideal length. Okay.
Let me try and do the first one first around what steps you would want to go through. So for this, what is kind of, I guess, the ideal scenario is that the material is developed as far as possible locally, given a really strong edit by a professional editor who can work with you on plain language, or training your team in working in to use plain language, and then testing the material with a genuine flexibility to be able to make amendments, learning from your testing. So, you know, to be able to cascade it a little bit through a couple of cluster partners, perhaps get some feedback from people who might be using the guidance and then incorporate that feedback in. And that's a step that very rarely gets to take place because there's often time pressures on getting things out. But that would be ideal. Also making sure that that there's a local illustrator or locally sourced photographs available. Mia, is there anything you would want to add into those steps, having just done the localization research?
No, I think those are great, and I think that to some extent, maybe I mean, of course, ideally this process should happen with any time any new guidance is produced, but I think that some of it can also be used or can be built upon. So, for example, understanding of how to deal with and translate acronyms or jargon is something that might take a little bit longer to do the first time around, but then it can be built on so that the process doesn't become always so lengthy or cumbersome.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. Good points. In terms of the ideal length, no, I don't think we found that there was one ideal length. People did recognise that there was a lot of content, and they wanted it. People wanted the information. So I don't think that there was one length that kind of fitted everybody. What I do think is that it's probably where there's lots of guidance that needs to be rolled out. I think the idea of making things more modular and making sure that sort of the front page or the first 2 pages of any module holds the absolute essence of what you're trying to convey is probably the most sensible approach. Some of the handbooks are very long indeed, 70+ pages. And that's probably, that's very definitely too long. And by breaking it up and producing, therefore, a series of modules with the key elements on the front of each, you'll probably be able to get the information to people more successfully than one longer document.
Great. There's another question around you mentioned disseminating resources through audio and video formats as well. Was there a stated preference across the board, and was that for in-depth description of a given resource or for more introduction of overall content? Any further detail on that would be useful.
Yeah,
formats.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, interestingly enough, it didn't come out as being a top favourite way of getting information, and I think that's related to people's bandwidth and lack of access to connectivity. So, although it came out as something that people quite liked, it wasn't something that people were crying out for. Where I think it's useful is around, and this came from the findings, was this ability to introduce a topic. So, for example, people were saying that they liked training courses as a way of getting a background to some information which they could then go away with the document. And I would have thought audio and audio-visual materials could be one way of achieving that without physical training courses going on. So you're able to produce, the top line messages of the document, what this document's going to be about, and frame it for people and give them a little bit of insights about perhaps how it can be used, and then have a link to the fuller document so that people can pull it, kind of pull down, and perhaps there also be able to sort of say, module 1 talks to you about this, module 2 talks to you about this. And produce that as the audio-visual sort of introduction, part of the audio-visual introduction, so that then people can download the particular module that they feel is most relevant, again, saving their bandwidth and reading time.
Thank you, Alice. Another question that came in is in relation to accessibility and whether resources are also translated into Braille.
We didn't find any Braille resources as we were going around. It doesn't mean that they don't exist at all, but there was certainly nothing available. And it did come out through all the focus groups when we talked to them about accessibility, was the need for signed information and Braille information. Now, we didn't go on to explore that, and in fact, in our research, we have recommended further research be done on the need for guidance for people who are partially sighted and deaf. And I'm not sure really what the next steps would be in terms of doing that research, but it would be very interesting to understand from the communities of people with disabilities how they would like to get information and to what extent they're already able to access information or not through the current system.
Indeed. There was a question on plain language itself and where people can find more, as this might not be known to all coordinators. And I did share the TWB guide on writing in plain language. And also when looking at the research report, there are some specific recommendations that relate to how to basically write in or produce guidance in line with plain language principles. So I've shared those links. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Alice, in terms of guidance on plain language itself.
Right. No, I mean, I think you'll find most of it in the guidance document that Mia has shared. I think also just to say that if anybody wants training in that, that's something that we offer. So we're very happy to be able to offer plain language training. But I'm sure there are also other organisations who can make that offer for you as well. And that it takes practice, I think, is the other thing. But that TWB is able to offer a service where we can review materials and make recommendations, not necessarily having to do the full edit, but just kind of come back to you and be able to do, to take a document and do an analysis and make some kind of key recommendations about how to improve it in terms of plain language.
Yeah. There's another question coming in relation to any information on if users are following links to other tools, policy, other guidance documents, etc. The person writing says, I see that guidance include links to lengthy documents in order to keep it short, but would that work?
Yeah, it's a good point. So one of the concerns that came out from people is where they get a summary document in the language that they do speak and then a link to a document in a language they don't speak, and how frustrating it can be not to be able to follow the links in the right languages. In terms of providing languages, in terms of providing links, I think this comes back to the information you're giving people. So it's not wrong to have material out there that's more substantial material, but I think it's really important to be able to tell people what it is they're going to be clicking, because once they click and it starts downloading, that's then they're paying for that data. So if you can say, if it's possible to say, this is the full report, it's, X megabytes, and it contains all of the following modules, or this is module A, this is module B, this is module C, each one is, the following volume. I think it gives people a better idea of the time and the kind of data payments that they're going to incur by doing doing a download. But I do think it's really important to also indicate the language that it's going to be in, because it must be incredibly frustrating if you're reading a summary, a really interesting summary document in Portuguese, and you click on the link to find the more substantial work and find it's all in English. So I think giving people that information about what it is they're going to click on, what language it is and how large it is before they click will save people a lot of frustration.
So there's actually another interesting question around whether there was any findings about gender and age differences in how people prefer to access guidance.
That's a very interesting question. There wasn't in terms of preference for access. And in fact, the differences between, because we did, of course, disaggregate by gender when we were looking at the data, but the difference between them wasn't very significant. I think what we found for example, in comprehension rates, when we were looking at the kind of people's ability to retain, to understand and retain the information, in one context, younger women were retaining more easily, and in another context the opposite was, that wasn't true, and it was older women. We've sort of found a few differences, but they weren't kind of significant enough for us to to learn from that in terms of sample size, but there wasn't an express difference in terms of ability of kind of mode of access. That's a really good question, though. I don't know, I don't know whether if we'd got a much larger sample, we would have got a different result. But I don't, certainly from our findings with the sample size that we had, we didn't see a difference in that.
Great. I think there's a very important comment here being made around that says we should take into account language sensitivities in a conflict context when translating into local languages. In many contexts, language is a driver of conflict. Perhaps, Alice, would you like to comment on that comment?
Absolutely, yes, I couldn't agree more. Absolutely, it's a driver of conflict in many places, and choosing the languages to make sure that you are providing equal access to information for everybody is really important. Feeling like you're never included and that your feedback isn't requested and that you're being excluded from information could obviously exacerbate conflict and communal tension. So I would absolutely agree with this, with whoever wrote that.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, of course, it is an important sensitivity to take into consideration also when collecting language data, and when collecting it and sharing it. And I think the most basic language should definitely be considered, especially in some contexts, should be considered as sensitive data. So the good practices that we do have in place for treating others as other sensitive data, might it be gender or sexual orientation or ethnicity and so on, can be easily applied also to language data, and that is what TWB does as well. In our own work when collecting and visualizing language data. There's another question, I guess, from the perspective of a cluster coordinator, and it says, as a cluster coordinator primarily disseminating, not necessarily developing guidance, what are the top 3 things you recommend I can do from a dissemination perspective?
Okay, so from a dissemination perspective, I would suggest making sure that you budget for making hard copies of materials would be a top recommendation, and obviously kind of advocating to get a budget for that. The second one would be to try and introduce the materials to people in some way, ideally through a meeting or through a training event where you can talk to people about the material and its relevance for their work. And the third thing, where you are able to distribute electronically, and I'm sure you would try and do every route available to you, people really prefer to have it emailed directly to them rather than be sent on a kind of search for a resource. So again, specifying what the document is, why it's useful, what language it's in, and how big it's going to be when they click on it, and then sending that to people's individual emails. Those would be my top 3, having looked at the research.
Thank you very much, Alice. If there are no other questions, perhaps we can go into the closing remarks.
Great.
Thanks, Alice. Thanks for the presentation and responding to questions. That was really good. And I forgot to introduce Mia. Mia is also from Translators Without Borders. And thanks, Mia, for helping asking the questions. Now, as closing remarks, I would like to pass on to Joyce from Child Protection Area of Responsibility. Joyce is the Deputy Coordinator of the Child Protection Area of Responsibility. Over to you, Joyce.
Thank you, Kemal. Please confirm you can hear me.
We can hear you well.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening for anybody who's already gone into the evening. First of all, thank you so much for joining us today. We do appreciate that you've taken the time to join us on the launch of this very important research report, and we hope that you found the presentation as well as the Q&A session very engaging. So I would just wanted to highlight a few points that we would also like to reiterate in terms of how we move forward. So first of all, the research is very important in terms of ensuring inclusivity in the way that we work, and also making sure that we engage as many of our partners as possible within our coordination groups for education and child protection, but also across other sectors or clusters. We do realize that the GEC, and the Child Protection Area of Responsibility are taking a lead on this front. But what we would like to see is how this information can be shared across the board and becomes a learning experience for other cluster members and other clusters. We would also like to reiterate the message about how we could allocate resources to review the guidance that we already have in place, but also when we are producing new guidance, and to apply some of the recommendations from this research so that the work that we do, the guidance that we produce, the materials that we produce are much more accessible and useful, and that people can use them and apply them in their work. And this call goes out specifically to donors as well as to international actors, because we are mostly the ones who are involved in the development of materials in general. And then last but not least, from the GEC and the CPOR, as well as the Translators Without Borders, we commit to sharing the research and the report, as well as the recommendations. We've already started doing that with the GPC and the areas of responsibility that includes child protection, GBV, mine action, and housing, land and property. But we hope that this can go beyond to other clusters. And we also look towards sharing this in the Global Protection Cluster Forum that will take place in September. So we encourage coordinators, partners, international agencies, UN agencies, and others who are interested to share this report widely. And we remain at hand to support the implementation of the recommendations. And we also remain at hand to answer any questions you may have that maybe were not addressed today. So once again, thank you very much to everybody for participating, but also to Translators Without Borders for all the work they've done on this. It's been a long journey and very good to see it come to fruition. But thanks to the GEC and the CPOR colleagues who worked very intensely on this. Thank you, and over to you, Kemal.
Thank you, Joyce. Very good remarks on the dissemination and implementation of the research. Just for everyone's information, the research, the report, and this recording will be available on the web pages of GEC and Child Protection AOR. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank you.